Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. We have some significant severe weather on tap for places that don't usually see it in this part of June. Southern Plains is coming alive with some severe weather over the next several days. This being the first day, we have an enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5, for parts of central to northeast Texas and to far northwest Louisiana, southwest Arkansas. Again, this is very unusual for this time of year to see significant severe weather this far south. Usually we start migrating that severe weather risk up toward Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, the Dakotas, etc. But this is how it goes this year. Subtropical jet is becoming a little bit supercharged here over the next several days, as we talked about in our video yesterday morning. And today is our first real significant severe threat of this upcoming stretch. Again, enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5, for basically centered right on northeast Texas, including the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and down toward Waco, Lufkin, Tyler, Longview, and Texarkana, places like that. All hazards on the table for today. We have a tornado threat. They just upgraded the tornado threat in the latest SPC outlook there. 5% tornado risk extending basically from the I-35 corridor, Dallas to Waco and areas east, all the way up to the Red River and far southeast Oklahoma, and then down to the south as well. But the main threats today are going to be large hail and damaging winds. Here is the large hail threat. Significant hail risk within that hatched area, especially within that 30% hatched area. Again, Dallas to Waco in that risk as well. And then a damaging wind threat, 30%, a widespread 30% area with that hatching to the southeast of Dallas, including places like Waco and areas to the east toward Lufkin. So significant severe weather is possible for today, and it is an all hazards threat. So let's go ahead and dive right in. This is our water vapor satellite imagery right here. First of all, if you hear a little bit of road noise outside, I apologize. Sitting right on the highway here in Vernon, Texas, and we're going to be heading east in just a little bit. So getting this video out before we head east today toward the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex for today's event. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive right in. This is the water vapor satellite imagery. Not a whole lot going on throughout the country. You do see this swirl out here, though, out across the west coast. This is a big old trough that has been situated here for quite some time. As we talked about in our video yesterday, we've been in somewhat of an omega block where we have a big ridge of high pressure here centered in between two troughs of low pressure. We have this trough here, this big old swirl you see here out across the northeast U.S. coast, and this big swirl out here out to the west, off the west coast. A little bit of ridging has been in place in between those two features, and hence the term omega block. But that ridge is expected to break down somewhat over the next several days, including today, where we start to see a little bit of a dampening of that ridge and a shortwave that is making its way into Texas today. You can't really see it on this water vapor satellite image, but I want to show you our upper air maps here. This is our 12Z 500 millibar map. And again, you see mostly zonal flow here, east-west flow out across the southern half of the country, with this big old trough here out across the northeast, trough here across the west coast. But you see this little shortwave in here, this little enhancement in the flow. This is what's going to dampen the ridge somewhat and allow for enough lift and severe weather ingredients for severe weather today out across this corridor of the southern plains. A little bit of enhanced flow associated with this little perturbation there, 30 to 40 knots there, making its way east slowly today, and by mid-afternoon or so, that will be the impetus for storm development today out across far southern Oklahoma into North Texas. Now let's show you what's going on right now. We have quite a bit of convection ongoing right now. This is our current radar. And we have this loosely organized line or cluster of storms that is making its way through Oklahoma. Initial band out here all the way in southeast Oklahoma now, with some storms behind there just moving through the Oklahoma City metro area in the last hour or so. This complex will continue to move off to the southeast today, move into places like far northeast Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. We could see a few severe warnings within this line, mainly for damaging winds, as this complex chugs off to the southeast. But back to the west, we're going to see mainly clear skies. We're going to see the visible satellite right now, and you see to the south of this complex Again, the complex moving this way, away from the target area for this afternoon's storms. And in the target area for this afternoon's storms, you see a mostly clear sky, just a few trashy clouds there, if you will, in northeast Texas, but mostly clear skies there. That is going to allow instability to build nicely today to the west of this complex. What you also see associated with this complex is an outflow boundary, and you see it right there, right out ahead, these little waves out ahead of this complex. That is the outflow boundary, and that is continuing to sag to the south and southeast, going into the late morning hours and the early afternoon hours today. Where that sets up is going to be critical. If storms can fire along that boundary, which is the boundary is going to be an expected initiating mechanism for storms today. Wherever that boundary sets up, it's going to be where the greatest severe threat is. So we're going to have to watch where this boundary sets up. Right now, it is still sagging quite a bit farther to the southeast, south and southeast. And through the morning hours, we're going to have to monitor where that ends up, as storms will fire along that. And we could see a little bit of an enhancement of low-level shear along that boundary for maybe an enhanced tornado threat for storms later on today. So again, the outflow, very critical where that ends up today. But again, this initial complex, not going to be an issue as far as messing up the environment for the storms later, as this complex will move off to the southeast with clear skies mostly on the western fringes. Let's go ahead and go back to our upper air maps there. Once again, you see that ridge. That amplitude of the ridge depressed somewhat. A little bit of shortwave here out across Oklahoma right now, helping to fuel these ongoing storms across Oklahoma. And this secondary shortwave back here in West Texas, that is going to be our main impetus for storm development later on this afternoon. Again, that is going to shift just slowly to the east today and be positioned somewhere here across central Texas by about mid-afternoon or so for another round of storm development along that outflow ahead of this mid-level wave. Now, we don't have a high amplitude trough here traversing the Rockies, so you wouldn't expect a strong low-level response. Let's go ahead and go look at 850 millibars. We do have some response, though. This zonal flow crossing the Rockies, some strengthening of that flow associated with that mid-level wave. That has allowed a little bit of a low-level cyclone to develop out here across West Texas. A little bit of strengthening of the flow there in northwest Texas, 25-30 knots there at 850 millibars. Down at the surface, we do see a weak surface low as well. Broad, weak surface low here situated across northwest Texas right now. That's going to pretty much stay put throughout the day. We're not going to see a whole lot of movement with this, whole lot of consolidation of this surface low. But we will have this surface low in place. Dry line will be situated to the south of it as well, as we have very high moisture content out to the east of the dry line. We'll take a look at some dew points here. Let me refresh this page real quick. So you see the dry line, loosely organized dry line at this point. It looks like we do see dew points in the 50s out here with winds out of the southwest. Out here across West Texas, more southerly or southeasterly winds here to the east of the boundary with dew points in the upper 60s to even mid-70s out here. Very, very juicy air mass out here across the eastern half of Texas. Would put the dry line somewhere probably right in this vicinity right now. A little bit tough to tell as it is not a very tight dry line yet, but that is expected to change throughout the day. We should see a tightening of that dry line here across central Texas. And again, the outflow boundary, where that intersects with the dry line, is going to be a nice initiating mechanism for storms. Probably will be somewhere in the vicinity of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex later on today. So everybody in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex needs to be on alert for significant severe weather today. We'll go back at the end and summarize the threats and the locations involved. But right now, again, you can see a very juicy air mass here. Dew points in the mid-70s, Dallas-Fort Worth, 81 over 74, 77 dew point just south of Dallas. So very, very juicy air mass there at the low levels here out across the eastern half of Texas. So moisture not going to be an issue for today's event. Let's go ahead and take a look at some 12Z soundings here. This is the Fort Worth sounding from 12Z, so 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time. And you already see we have a pretty impressive thermodynamic environment in place. Already about 1,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, and that is at 7 a.m. And so we see a very unstable air mass already in place. Not very unstable, but an unstable air mass already in place. That is expected to really increase as the day goes on with that strong surface heating. Temperatures already reaching about 80 there at Dallas-Fort Worth, expected to surge into probably the low 90s today out across north central Texas. So a low 90s temperature with a low 70s dew point. that is a very, very thick, juicy air mass. And so those folks in Northeast Texas, not talking about storms here, it's going to be a very juicy air mass today, very humid, very moist. It's going to be a very much like a sauna outside today. Now, for severe weather, that is a good thing. We like to see that air mass really become very thermodynamically unstable, and that's what we have already. We are expecting mixed layer capes to exceed probably 3,000 to 4,000 joules per kilogram here going into today, given this strong this instability already in place, this strong surface heating likely to take place, and some cooling that is expected to occur aloft with the approach of that mid-level shortwave trough. You can already see steep lapse rates in place as well. Very steep lapse rates here at Dallas-Fort Worth in this layer, above probably 8 to 9 degrees Celsius per kilometer. That is very steep lapse rates there as a result of the elevated mixed layer. We talk about the EML every video, it seems, on this channel because it is so important in severe weather forecasting. The EML is that layer of warm, dry, well-mixed air that originates on the higher terrain out west, Arizona, New Mexico, western Mexico, West Texas, and gets transported out to the east atop that moist layer in the low levels. That allows instability to build throughout the day and keep storm formation at bay for much of the day until that cap can be eroded. EML erosion should not be a problem today, given the strong surface heating likely to take place and the approach of the mid-level trough that is expected to help cool the mid-levels of the atmosphere and decrease that EML going into the afternoon. The low-level moisture is fairly shallow at this point, not a deep moist layer that we like to see usually. We should probably see some moistening going into the afternoon today, given the approach of that trough, continued low-level warm moist advection, and the erosion of this capping inversion. We should see some moistening there in the low levels, so that shouldn't be too much of an issue going into the afternoon. The hodograph, though, is going to be on the margins today for supercells. We should see some supercells, again, given an increase in deep layer shear later on with the approach of that trough. Right now, it's not a hodograph that you would think would be very favorable for severe weather. Not a lot of deep layer shear to speak of. In fact, effective bulk shear here at Dallas-Fort Worth this morning, only at 18 knots. That is well below the margins for supercells that we like to see. Again, we should see some modest increase in those mid-level winds. Again, 500 millibar winds right now, only about 10 to 15 knots there. That should increase somewhat with the approach of the trough. That should increase shear a little bit, but still will be on the lower ends for what we usually see for severe weather events across the southern plains. But will be adequate for supercells with those severe hazards in play. And again, you see that large hail is a factor today, given the steep blast rates aloft, the elevated mixed layer, strong instability, and likely to be initially weak low-level shear here before the mid-level trough and surface low really take shape, except for along that outflow boundary, maybe a slight increase in low-level shear along that outflow boundary. Let's go ahead and take a look at some model data. This is the 6Z NAM. The 12Z isn't quite in yet, so we'll take a look at the 6Z NAM. This is 500 millibars. And you see that shortwave trough out west initialized nicely there. Going to be moving off to the east today slowly. You see that kink in the flow moves east just ever so slowly there across Texas today. Again, by 21Z, it's positioned somewhere there in central Texas with some enhanced flow aloft associated with that. Moving into the region, that will help strengthen deep layer shear for a supercell threat. This is valid at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. This is at 7 p.m. That trough moves nicely to the east, timed well with our diurnal cycle as surface heating will take place throughout much of the day, really boosting instability. Let's go down to 850 millibars here, show you the low-level jet. Again, that's going to be a fairly modest low-level jet, only 20, 25 knots or so maybe across this region with some slight increase. This could be convectively enhanced here out across this region, but we still should see maybe a slight increase in the low-level jet going into the evening. That should lengthen and allow for some more curvature in those hodographs going into the evening. We'll show you that in just a second. Let's go ahead and zoom into the Southern Plains sector here and show you the surface pattern. So here's that surface low situated across northwest Texas right now. Again, that's going to stay put throughout much of the day. Not really much going on in terms of a strengthening of that surface low throughout the day, given that we don't really have a strong upper level response. Temperatures, though, expected to warm very, very strongly. The NAM has temperatures of 100 degrees here out across this area. Dallas-Fort Worth expected to hit 100 degrees today. If that's the case, we should have no problem getting storms to go, although that might make the temperature dew point spreads a little bit on the high side. So 100 degrees, that is very warm. So even with surface moisture around maybe 72, 73 degrees for your dew point, that's still going to be a temperature dew point spread in the upper 20s, well above what we normally like to see for a significant tornado threat. Areas to the east a little bit cooler, and usually, as we've talked about before, the NAM often has a cool bias here. So perhaps it has the dry line a little bit farther to the east. Let's take a look there with that. So it does have the dry line somewhat loosely organized there, but the best moisture out to the east, here to the east of Dallas-Fort Worth. Temperatures a little bit cooler out here, maybe in the low to mid 90s. That should keep those temperature dew point spreads down just a little bit toward that 20-degree mark, which is that threshold for tornadic activity we like to use. Still on the margins for tornadic activity, but definitely would favor a tornado or two with the initial activity. So very, very warm temperatures here, especially to the west of that dry line. With this kind of moisture in place, that is going to be a sauna out there today for you folks in the north to central and east Texas regions. So this is our moisture as well. So you see that moisture, that dry line starts to take shape there. Again, not a super tight dry line. You have a very, not a tight gradient at all here. You see 40s dew points out here across west central Texas, very slowly transitioning to those 60s and 70s dew points out east. So not a very tight dry line at all, but should be a dry line nonetheless. Should be some convergence along there. You do see some southwesterly winds transitioning to more southerly winds out here. So we do have some surface convergence out here, maybe just on the east side of Dallas-Fort Worth. Again, wherever that outflow boundary intersects that dry line will be a favored location for initial storm development. Now let's take a sounding or two here from the warm sector. We'll do one here at 21Z, just east of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex there on I-20, going toward the Louisiana border, out ahead of the initial activity. So this is what we're dealing with today. Surface temperatures out here a little bit lower, 91. Dew point here on the NAM at 76. That may be a little bit on the high side, but wouldn't be shocked to see that at all out there. So this is, again, valid at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And you see what's going on with this sounding. Cape here, modeled by the NAM, mixed layer cape, above 5,600 joules per kilogram. That is considered extreme instability. You see all this area between the parcel trace, the blue dash line, and the red line here, our atmospheric temperature. That is very, very strong instability that we're dealing with today. That may be almost too much for a significant hail threat. There can be too much of a good thing. We still have steep lapse rates and ample instability in place here with somewhat weak low-level shear, some curvature in those low-level hodographs there, but you can see that those hodographs are not very long at all. Very much a condensed hodograph. That's because deep layer shear here is still modeled by the NAM to be only at about 25 knots or so. That is still kind of below the margins that we like to see for supercells. Again, out east, we're a little bit removed from the best winds aloft. We go back out here just a little bit to the west, out here toward Dallas-Fort Worth. Let's take a look here. You see temperatures, that inverted V profile there, given the over 100 degree surface temperatures. Your hodographs here still not very large at all. I would expect to see a little bit more of an increase in the deep layer shear here by this point, by mid-afternoon here across the region. So I'm not sure how much I believe these hodographs. I would expect them to be maybe a little bit longer than what they are now as modeled on the NAM. We'll go to 0Z here as well to just take a look just east of the DFW Metroplex, just to see what's going on here. And by this point, we do see that deep layer shear value up to about 30 knots. That is on the lower end, but still adequate for supercells, and definitely a strengthening of that low-level hodograph. A lot more curvature there in the low levels by 0Z, 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Almost 300 meters square per second squared of effective storm relative helicity. And a nice curvature in the hodograph there. Still, hodographs not very long at all, kind of folded in on themselves with a storm motion to the just southeast there. That may mean a little bit more of a high precipitation mode. With the lack of deep layer shear in a relative sense, that could mean also that we see a quicker transition to a more messy clustered mode, as storms may struggle to become supercellular over a wide area. Lots of multicells with some supercells embedded in there. But nonetheless, large hail going to be a threat. You can see that strong instability there with somewhat weaker low-level shear to start. That could foster a large hail threat with initial development, maybe a tornado or two given this nice low-level shear there before storms eventually do congeal into more of a complex by this evening. Let's take a look at a convective allowing model here. The main ones are not quite in yet, but we'll look at the 12Z run here of the HRRR. And again, this is what future radar might look like later on. It's initialized the complex pretty well here across Oklahoma. So it moves that off to the southeast. Some modest strengthening as we go into the late morning to early afternoon hours here as the complex moves into Arkansas, far northeast Texas. And again, behind that, the trailing outflow boundary, wherever that sets up, again, is going to be critical to where storms will fire later on. And eventually it does fire storms here by mid to late afternoon out across the Red River down to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Initially, semi-discrete supercells, a mix of multicells and some semi-discrete supercells likely here from the Red River southward. Again, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex is going to be very close, I think, to where those initial storms fire. But anywhere in this corridor from the Red River, far southeast Oklahoma, southward toward the I-35 corridors and I-45 corridors, going to have to be on alert for that initial development, which will favor large hail, some very large hail as well, and a tornado or two. And then by evening, we start to see a congealing of this complex into more of a line, congealing of these storms into more of a complex or line. Some semi-discrete updrafts there towards 0Z when hodographs get large. Any discrete supercells that remain here when those hodographs get, those low-level hodographs get nice and large, will have an enhanced tornado threat, especially those along the boundary. But then eventually we will see a congealing into a line of storms moving into southeast Texas going into the evening. So that's what's going on for today. Once again, an enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 for northeast Texas. Places like Dallas, Fort Worth, and Waco under the gun for today. Everyone in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex needs to be on alert for significant severe weather. That does include a tornado or two, 5% there from DFW to Waco and eastward, and as well as damaging winds and some large to very large hail. Again, strong instability, weak low-level shear initially should favor large to very large hail in these supercells. Again, we have so much instability in the atmosphere that may be too much of a good thing as far as the hail threat goes, but we'll have to watch that for sure, as those initial storms could produce some very large hail. 30% hatched area there, Dallas-Fort Worth to Waco. Everyone in that red hatched area needs to be on alert for significant hail today, as well as damaging winds, especially as that complex moves off to the southeast later on into the evening and nighttime hours toward east central Texas, Waco, eastward to Lufkin, and areas in between. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.